Previously on AP World History, we discussed how the American Revolution is actually the product of a much larger war, the 7 Years' War, between Britain and Prussia on the one hand, and basically the rest of Europe on the other, specifically France, the Austrian Empire, and Russia. And Britain manages to win, but it manages to win only by maxing out its proverbial credit card and spending everything that it has. Again, Britain basically pays its or buys its way to victory. So to help pay for these debts, Parliament starts implementing direct taxes on the American colonies. The American colonies basically respond that we are British subjects too, and we believe in Magna Carta, and you can't tax us because we're not represented in the British Parliament. We have our own basically colonial legislatures that have that specific purpose. You want to pass taxes on us? Work through them. The British are like, well, that'd be too much work. And so they decide to tax the colonies anyway. We eventually get to a tax on tea, where a radical group called the Sons of Liberty violently protests that by boarding ships in Boston Harbor and basically overthrowing tea into the water, worth millions of dollars / pounds. The British retaliate by basically shutting down the Massachusetts colonial government by implementing martial law and also closing Boston Harbor. Yay, collective punishment. Finally, we talked about the fact that British troops in Boston tried to defuse the situation by basically raiding an armory or munitions depot operated by the Sons of Liberty. The idea is that if they take away the Americans' guns, well then, even if they did want to revolt, they wouldn't be able to. There is a confrontation at Concord, Massachusetts, in which British and American forces open fire on one another. But this is after a very long standoff, and neither side really wants a war. Both sides think that eventually the other will back down. So basically they're playing chicken with 18th century muskets, which I do not recommend, actually. So we have a skirmish at Lexington and Concord, which means that the British attempt to seize the arms operated by the Sons of Liberty doesn't exactly go as planned. But then the unthinkable happens. So hundreds and then thousands of Americans start appearing almost from out of nowhere. They form ad hoc and impromptu battalions and companies, and they start chasing this small British force of about 600 men all the way back to Boston. And by the time the Americans reach Boston, their numbers have swollen to very nearly 20,000 troops, very much outnumbering the British Army in Boston. So this is kind of the weird part of the American Revolution. And that is, you basically just get this army from out of nowhere, and there's no leadership, there's no organization, there's no hierarchy, and the question is, how are you going to control it? Well, meeting around this time period was a group called the Second Continental Congress. The Second Continental Congress was composed of delegates who were considered sort of the best and brightest of their respective colonial legislatures. So this is where you get people like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, John Hancock, the OG list of founding fathers. So at first, if you look at what's going on in Massachusetts, you really just have a war or a conflict between Britain and just one colony. There's nothing that says that a Massachusetts war has to become an American War of Independence. That's kind of the furthest thing from the minds of most of the colonists. But what starts to change their minds a little bit is the fact that the British deliberately disband Massachusetts' colonial legislature because of the actions of a few dozen agitators. And even traditional British politicians in the Second Continental Congress started asking themselves, okay, if the British can disband Massachusetts' legislature, what's to stop them from doing that to ours? So what they decide to do is they decide to adopt this army that is spontaneously formed in New England. And use it basically as leverage to negotiate with the British. The idea is that they can ignore the Second Continental Congress just in general, because they're just a few hundred people, or a few dozen people, actually. But if this Congress has an army behind it, then the British government is going to be forced to actually negotiate. So it's at this point that the founders in Philadelphia start discussing, okay, who is going to take command of this army? It's an army almost exclusively made up of New Englanders, and so the logical choice would be for a New Englander to lead it. And that is why they picked George Washington. George Washington is not a New Englander. He is a Virginian. He comes to the Second Continental Congress already in uniform. It's basically the 18th century equivalent of practically just handing out your resume for the job to be commander of this Continental Army. But Washington has a number of strong points that he has going for him. Most notably, he's a Virginian. Yeah, it's not exactly a nepotism hire, but it's kind of close. Okay, and so the reason that they selected George Washington is because he's a Virginian. So now a Virginian, Virginia being one of the most pro-English colonies that there were, or that there was, a Virginian is leading an army of New Englanders. That communicates the fact that this is no longer a revolt of Massachusettsians. This is truly an American war. The question is, what is the goal of this American war? Well, essentially, after making these decisions, the Continental Congress also issues a directive or a letter to be sent to the king. It's called the Olive Branch Petition. Olive branch meaning that you're basically trying to, seek peace, right? But that doesn't really do it justice. Basically, think of it as it's after a nasty breakup, and this is the point of the breakup where you're like, please take me back. So the American colonists were like, please, King George, take us back. And the reason the Olive Branch Petition is so important and is so interesting is that the civics version of U.S. history, you might hear something like the idea that Americans were anti-monarchy. That's BS. Americans in general were fairly pro-monarchy. And you can see this because of how they negotiate with the king. So really at this point, the dispute has been between colonial legislatures on the one hand and the British Parliament on the other. Remember that Britain has a constitutional monarchy where, for the most part, the king doesn't directly get involved in day-to-day affairs of government. But the Olive Branch Petition asked the king to basically intercede on the colony's behalf, basically tell Parliament to cut it out. They basically say that, hey, we're your royal subjects, your loyal subjects. I'm resisting the urge to break out into the Hamilton song. And so take us back, because this is all a big misunderstanding. Well, King George III disagreed. He responds to the Olive Branch Petition by basically saying that everybody who signed this letter, this petition, is a traitor. And unless they recant and formally totally surrender, they will be considered traitors and will be hanged as traitors. Yeah. So at this point, the founders kind of start thinking maybe there's not exactly a chance to go back to the way things were. So if there's not a chance to go back to the way things were, and if King George had basically burnt a lot of the bridges, well, we might as well just be independent. And so on July 4th, 1776, you have the signing of probably the most important breakup letter in world history. That is the Declaration of Independence. What does it really accomplish? Well, in terms of the legal consequences, not much. It just basically serves to give notice to the British government that the goal is going to be American independence, not a renegotiation of the relationship between the colonies and the rest of the empire. But if John Locke had a baby, and I'm not sure if he did, it could very well be the Declaration of Independence. It's basically the culmination of all this Enlightenment ideology. You see the existence of natural rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You see things like we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So it's kind of like peak Enlightenment there. That being said, none of this really matters unless the American colonies can preserve their independence on the battlefield, and let's just say that at first they don't. The Continental Army gets the crap kicked out of it by the British win most of the battles, the British mostly outmaneuver the Americans, as they should, because the Americans were completely inexperienced at this kind of thing. The British were pretty good at it. So the Americans at a very early point decide that they need to get other European powers involved. And if you remember, there were tons of European powers that were still salty about the result of the 7 Years' War, and so you eventually have the French who come in and provide aid. And not just the French, the Spanish also declare war on Great Britain. And so basically, the American Revolution leads to a war where Britain is fighting on all fronts. Now, the British actually defeat the French and the Spanish for the most part. They just can't defeat the Americans. Or at least it becomes clear to the British that this whole war was to protect the right of Parliament to issue taxes. What's the point of a tax? Well, to raise money. Well, what is the British government doing? Well, it's spending lots of money to defend Parliament's right to raise money in tax. Oh, yeah, that doesn't make any sense, does it? So, the British let the American colonies go in the Treaty of Paris of 1783. The first half decade or so of American independent existence was kind of cringe, because basically everything that could go wrong went wrong. Everything from hyperinflation to internal rebellion to a system of government that really wasn't able to effectively deal with either of those two problems. And also there were problems on the frontier where basically a Native American force wiped out almost the entirety of the peacetime U.S. Army. Wasn't good. So, once again, we see the creation or the organization of a group of delegates, the best and brightest of their colonial legislatures, or state legislatures at this point, who were supposed to meet in Philadelphia to amend this flawed system of government called the Articles of Confederation. Once they get to Philadelphia, they realize that the Articles of Confederation is so bad it's beyond saving, and they just decide to start from scratch. So in 1789, they create the U.S. Constitution. What you should know is that it has separation of powers between, of course, the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. There are supposed to be checks and balances between all those branches. And you also have the sharing of powers between the central government, or the national government, and state governments. Now, the thing is that many of these state governments were antsy about the creation of a strong centralized government, because from their perspective, they were like, didn't we just have a rebellion to break away from a strong centralized government? Aren't we creating another one? So as a way to kind of sweeten the deal, the founders basically said, oh, fine, if you insist. And they provide certain guarantees in the Bill of Rights that the federal government won't go too far, like the British did. What you should also understand is that the Bill of Rights, well, one, this is what most people think of as the actual Constitution. People don't wax poetic about Article 1, I've noticed. They do wax poetic about the Bill of Rights, as they should, because if you think about something like the First Amendment, there's maybe no paragraph in the history of humanity that gets more done than the First Amendment. Think about it. It protects the right to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion and from religion, basically freedom from a theocracy. Like, it gives you 5 really important rights just right off the bat. But it's also important to know that the Bill of Rights was not the point of the Constitution. It was done to sweeten the deal so that the Constitution could be ratified. And also what you should know is that the Bill of Rights only protects people from the actions of the national government. It doesn't protect people from the actions of state governments. So, for example, you still had state churches, official state churches, all the way until the mid-19th century. States could and did arrest people for certain types of speech that they didn't like. Also, the federal government really had no police force that could effectively arrest people, so even if it wanted to violate the Bill of Rights, it also really couldn't. The Bill of Rights really starts to become relevant once we get into the 1860s and 1870s. And you'll find out why when you get to APUSH. So now we have to very quickly summarize like a century of U.S. history. So there's this sense that America is a country of the frontier. And some of the founders talked about the United States as a country that is supposed to span the continent and supposed to spread Republican values. I think either Adams or Jefferson calls it an empire of liberty. So this idea is manifest destiny. The idea that Americans are destined, or you might even say entitled, to expand all the way to the Pacific. One thing that kind of helps that out is the Louisiana Purchase, where the United States is effectively doubled in size. The other thing that helps there is this war called the Mexican-American War, where the U.S. basically acquires territories like California, Arizona, New Mexico, etc. The United States, well, as we said, some of the founders viewed the United States as an empire of liberty, but the federal government was still pretty small and didn't really have the strength to be a real traditional European empire. But that starts to change into the 1820s, where you see the promulgation of something called the Monroe Doctrine, where the United States government basically demands that Europeans basically stay away from the Western Hemisphere. That would be both North and South America. Now, the thing is that the United States doesn't really have the force to repel European incursion, but what they're really afraid of is they're afraid of the Europeans cutting off their whole manifest destiny gig. They're also afraid of Europeans basically coming back and trying to resubjugate the United States like the British did in the American Revolution, or tried to do in the American Revolution. Okay, the American Civil War. How to summarize that in just a few minutes. So first thing you need to understand is that the founders believed that slavery was going to die out on its own accord. So many anti-slavery founders, like for example Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, didn't really push the issue of slavery at the Constitutional Convention. The assumption was that slavery would die out, and that's because the economics of slavery just didn't really support that model anymore. What changed that, of course, is the development of the cotton gin, which, in a tragic bit of irony, was actually designed to make slavery obsolete. And in fact, what happens is it makes slavery more essential than ever for the Southern and even national economy. So it's also around this time period that you begin to see the emergence of the abolitionist movement. There have been other anti-slavery movements and even anti-slavery, like I'll even say religions or cults, but the abolitionist movement is what separates it is that it makes the argument that slavery is bad because slavery is evil. And in the South, there's sort of an equal and opposite reaction where Southern slave owners start to talk about how slavery is biblically mandated in the Bible. And so you have two sides of the country that are becoming increasingly polarized on the issue of slavery. And eventually you actually have the creation of an anti-slavery political party called the Republican Party. Southerners view abolitionists literally like terrorists. It becomes a crime in the 1830s to distribute abolitionist literature in the state of South Carolina. The reason being is because Southerners are one, they're attached to the economic model. I mean, there's that. But also they're afraid that abolitionists intend to launch an anti-slavery rebellion that will basically kill them all. So in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, wins the election. And because Abraham Lincoln is the candidate from an anti-slavery party, that prompts most of the southern states to secede from the Union. That doesn't mean there's a civil war, and in fact, Abraham Lincoln was only moderately against slavery. He just believed that slavery shouldn't expand beyond where it already existed. So as long as slavery doesn't encroach onto places like California, Colorado, Oregon, places like that, he's not going to try to rock the boat. In some ways, very much like the founders. What changes is, of course, the fact that the South believes that any anti-slavery candidate, even a moderate one, would lead to that big anti-slavery or slave rebellion, and would also lead to the government passing an amendment to abolish slavery. Okay, so that's sort of these are the long-term reasons. Short-term reasons is, of course, the federal government has to basically remove a lot of its forces in the South. One place that it doesn't remove itself from is Fort Sumter, right outside of Charleston Harbor. The Southern or South Carolina forces basically tell them to get lost. The federal government forces tell South Carolina to pound sand, and instead of pounding sand, they actually pound the walls with a barrage of rifled cannonballs. So that is the first real battle of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, from this point, calls up 70,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion in the South, and that is the closest we get to an official beginning of the American Civil War. If you look at the battles of the American Civil War, I mean, the South actually does pretty well militarily. Where they get absolutely smacked is in the North's industrial output. The North is more industrial, and the North also finds out that actually industrialization can lead to military victory. So they basically industrialize and industrialize and industrialize and build railroads and arms manufactories and all of these things, and the South is slowly but surely ground into dust. Now, the North, during the Civil War, at first, or I should say the Union, because it's not just the North, the Union during the American Civil War wants to just basically reunify the country. Any opinion that Abraham Lincoln had about slavery, he basically set aside when the South left the Union. Also, think about that. Like, you're Abraham Lincoln. You show up to the White House, and half the country has already seceded from the Union because you have been elected president. Abraham Lincoln has the worst first day on the job of any American president. And you know what? He also has the worst last day on the job. So it is tough to be Abraham Lincoln. He doesn't want to go down in history as being the last president of the United States of America. And so he sets aside those anti-slavery convictions. What begins to change there is he also understands that the reason the country has become disunited is over the issue of slavery. What if the South is brought back into the Union without resolving that fundamental issue? So he begins to move in a much more anti-slavery direction by first issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. This abolishes the slave status of slaves that are basically found by the Union Army. Then he also shepherds through the passage of the 13th Amendment, which is a constitutional amendment that abolishes slavery. So the American Civil War abolishes chattel slavery for Black Americans. As we'll find out, the story is a lot more complicated after that, but still, the abolition of chattel slavery is a huge accomplishment. However, if you're looking at the fate of Native Americans, let's just say that you're not going to find as happy an ending. So firstly, we have to be honest about the fact that the founders basically believed that Native Americans should assimilate or they should die. There wasn't this view among most Americans that Native Americans were of a different race in the same way that black people were of a different race. There was this idea that being a Native American was largely a cultural phenomenon, and if you abandoned the culture, you abandoned being a Native American. So there's this pressure placed upon Native Americans to assimilate or they're going to be driven out of their land. Many tribes do not, but some very much do, including tribes like the Creek, the Choctaw, and the Cherokee. Okay, so that being said, well, let me go back. The chief of the Cherokee Nation was a guy by the name of John Ross. John Ross had a Scottish parent and a Native American parent. He could pass as both white in white frontier towns and Cherokee in Cherokee frontier towns. Speaking of Cherokee frontier towns had their own courthouses, they had their own newspaper, and you would be hard-pressed to find many meaningful differences between Cherokee towns and any other white frontier town. So there's a lot of assimilation going on. But the problem, at least for the Cherokee, was that in the late 1820s, it was discovered that there was gold in the small town of Dahlonega. And of course, that is on Cherokee land. And so you get a flood of prospectors that want this land so they can basically mine for gold. The federal government basically encourages state governments to start basically kicking Native Americans off their land. Why? I kid you not, some of the excuses revolve around protection of the Native Americans from the evils of vice and alcohol. So, the Cherokee respond to that by doing the most American thing ever. They file a lawsuit that goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules in their favor, saying that it's unconstitutional for state governments to basically repossess Native American land. But President Andrew Jackson, who is in office at that point in time, says that the Chief Justice, Mr. John Marshall, has made his ruling. Now let him enforce it. And so thousands of Native Americans are forcibly removed from their homes, and thousands die along this pathway called the Trail of Tears, which leads them all the way to Oklahoma. This goes into a fair bit of depth on the ghost dance movement, and I think the ghost dance movement is really cool, but that's also kind of surprising to me because as an American history person by origin, I would have picked a number of other sort of resistance movements and episodes. But if we are going to talk about the ghost dance movement, this is a much more passive form of resistance compared to even, say, filing a lawsuit. This was developed by a Native American by the name of Wovoka, who believes that basically performing these ritualistic and shamanistic dances would drive white Americans away from Native American land. And it was believed that these dances would awaken dead ancestors who would drive them away. Ultimately, the U.S. Army decides to repress the ghost dance movement, and it actually leads to the last major battle on the frontier, the Battle of Wounded Knee, which is more properly considered, I think, a massacre, because a lot of the violence was against civilians, and battle sort of implies that both sides are sort of evenly matched, and in actual fact, what happens is that the Native Americans get machine gunned. To wrap everything up, and to transition to what we're going to talk about tomorrow, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the British government was kind of notorious for this policy called impressment. This has nothing to do with impressing people. It means that the British would stop ships, even American ships, on the high seas, would search them, and if deserters from the British Royal Navy were discovered, they would often forcibly return them. This was totally legal under British law. And eventually, this and many other reasons, leads to another conflict between Britain and the United States called the War of 1812. It also leads to the Embargo Act of 1807, where Thomas Jefferson literally bans trade overseas. Now, that being said, for the United States, it was viewed as impressment was viewed as inhumane and a fairly one-sided moral question. From the perspective of the British government, however, the British were fighting for their very existence. They were fighting against a young artillery officer who would become Emperor of the French because of the French Revolution. I'm referring, of course, to Napoleon Bonaparte, who we'll talk about next time. Till then.